everyone. My name is Emily, and I am from the Miami University Alumni Association. Thank you for joining us this afternoon as we chat with Steve Conn, author of The Lies of the Land. Steve is the W.E. Smith Professor of History at Miami University, where he teaches courses in Miami history. He was previously on the faculty in the history department at Ohio State University. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1994. Steve has spoken on a variety of topics around the country and around the world. As a popular and engaging speaker, he is on the roster of distinguished lecturers at the Organization of American Historians. Originally from Philadelphia, Steve Conn is now a resident of the funky town of Yellow Springs. There he is active in a variety of civic activities and projects. Before we turn it over to Steve, I wanted to remind live viewers that they can ask questions and comments by using the Ask a Question button below the video, so feel free to submit those throughout the webinar. Thank you for being here with us today, Steve, and with that being said, go ahead and take it away.
Wonderful. So thank you, Emily, for having me. Thank you, JJ, as well from the Alumni Association. And to all of you out there in streaming land, what a pleasure. And thank you for having me. Thank you for turning up on what, at least here in East Coast time, is lunch hour. I don't know, maybe some of you are a little earlier in the morning. So the title of my talk today, Demystifying Rural America. What I want to do here for the next little while is maybe examine the way we think we understand rural America and then offer an alternative way of thinking about it. So at some level, I want to unpack some myths. And yes, as Emily said, this is really a talk that derives from a book I published about a year ago, and which I seems to have struck a chord with people, and I've had an opportunity to talk to lots of groups about it. And I think if there's one takeaway from my book right now, it's that the holidays are almost here, people, and everybody loves a book as a gift, and so it's available in fine bookstores everywhere, and I would and so there we are. Okay. So as I said, what I want to do is try to unpack what I see as some of our mythical understandings about what we mean when we use the word rural. And I'm going to start with Thomas Jefferson. We're going to pick on Jefferson a little bit. Jefferson certainly stands as maybe the most flamboyant, but certainly not the only figure from the late 18th century who believed that the success of the American experiment rested on the people who lived in rural places. And just as a reminder, in 1790, which is the date of the first census count, which is, of course, mandated in the Constitution, roughly 5% of Americans lived in cities, and therefore 95% of Americans lived out in rural areas, primarily farmers, primarily agricultural areas. But as you can see here from the quotes I've pulled, and there are lots and lots of quotes like this, it's not just that farmers are important to us economically. They are our most valuable citizens, according to Jefferson. They are the most vigorous, the most independent, and the most virtuous. They are tied to their country and wedded to its liberty. Now, we might pause a moment and sort of look at the irony of this, because, of course, Jefferson himself never picked up a plow in his life. He had over 100 enslaved people to do that for him. But look at all of the kind of baggage that has now been put on this yeoman farmer figure. Not just you got to work the fields, but you are responsible for carrying the moral virtue of our citizenry. And as somebody, as Emily said, originally from Philadelphia, where I grew up with St. Benjamin Franklin, an urbanite through and through, some of us would say, well, he was a pretty valuable citizen, given all the things he got up to. And I wonder how Franklin would have reacted to the notion that it's really the cultivators of the earth who we value. Here's an image from the late 18th century, maybe early 19th century. Can't quite remember the date on it. And here is our yeoman figure, right? Because almost immediately, what Jefferson is describing becomes an icon rather than a real person. And I draw your attention to the little lithograph on the left-hand side of this slide, where we are asked to venerate the plow. Not admire it, not encourage it, but to venerate it. And venerate, of course, is a word a verb we usually associate with a religious practice. That's the extent to which this cultural ideal of the yeoman farmer, the independent landowning farmer, has been elevated in our cultural mythology. The problem here for this urban myth, for this rural myth, is that, in fact, whatever it was we wanted to believe, the numbers point in exactly the other direction. The graph you're looking at here compares the urban and rural populations of the United States from 1790, there on the left-hand side of the graph, to 2010. And what you see here is that the graph line is more or less uninterrupted. So there we are in 1790. I mentioned already about 5% of Americans live in cities. That's the blue. And by the time you get to 2010, we're approaching 80% of Americans are now urbanites or metropolitanites of one kind and another. The rural population of the country has consistently declined from the very beginning. We are a highly urbanized nation, and yet we continue, I think, to cling to the mythologies that are formed here in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. That, it seems to me, is a fundamental conundrum which we have to wrestle with if we're going to understand what rural America is, but also what we want to believe that it is. And that's part of what I want to talk about today. Our rural myth, I'm going to argue for you, and please punch back with questions if you'd like. What we did was to turn the mythology of America as a nation of small independent farmers into a kind of political ideology. I'll break this ideology up into approximately 3 parts. First, this notion of a kind of rugged individualism, right, which is at the center of American identity then, and I would argue, I think, today. I've quoted you from one of these figures from the mid-20th century. Agriculture is an individualistic way of life. Urban life is essentially cooperative. And unlike what you may have learned in kindergarten, in this case, the word cooperative is bad. Individualism is good. Now, is any of that true? Not really, but nonetheless, this has become part of our the ideology of American identity. Likewise, independence and self-sufficiency. There's Gary Cooper. Some of you may recognize that from the movie High Noon. The idea that what Americans really are, we stand alone, we're independent, we don't rely on other people. You remember the plot of Gary Cooper. He's got to chase the bad guys out of town, and all the other townspeople bail out on him. He has to do it all on his own. And the other movie poster I've thrown in here, which reiterates the same kind of trope, is Paul Newman's movie, Fort Apache, the Bronx. No cowboys, no Indians, just one cop. So that's a second piece of what I would call this ideology. The third piece, and this has been a consistent undertow in American political discourse, is a suspicion of, or indeed an anger at, a central government, the federal government. There's Ronald Reagan making that famous announcement in his inaugural address in 1981. But Reagan was simply recapitulating language that was there in the 19th century and is certainly still here with us in the 21st century. So government represents the antithesis of this world of the yeoman farmer. And the world of the yeoman farmer is individualistic. It's self-sufficient, and it does not rely on the cooperative mechanisms of government. Okay, so that's the ideology as I would sketch it out for you. All of this, and here is Sarah Palin from 2008, amounts to what is our real American identity. Sarah Palin made this comment, and some of you may remember this, in October 2008 during that presidential campaign when she was running as the vice presidential white town, but we can pause over that if we'd like. But as I said, she's simply recapitulating this mythology, which develops from the late 18th century onward. So, what's the alternative? If that's not really the way, if I'm insisting that this is all a myth, or most of it is a myth, or so how should we instead look at it? Well, let me open up the hood of the car here for a moment to say, when I sat down to do this book, I thought I was going to be writing about what I just described to you. And as I did my research, and this is what happens when historians do their work, the sources I was discovering and digging into were pointing me in another direction. And this happens every time I do a book project. I think I'm going this way, but in fact, I'm going that way, because the sources drive the work that we do. What seemed to me to become increasingly clear is that rural America and urban America have been shaped largely by the same forces in American life, certainly since the end of the Civil War. So let's say the last third of the 19th century and straight through to today. So what I decided to do in this book is to look at what I see as four of the largest big forces that have shaped modern America, and to ask the question, how have they impacted rural America, and in turn, how has rural America impacted them? It's a two-way street. So what are those four forces? Let me go over them with you now, just and give you a little taste of what I was digging into. Well, the first of these is the military. I think it is unarguable that the military has played and continues to play a central role in American life. All one has to do is look at the discretionary budget of the United States approved by Congress, and what you will discover is that the Pentagon receives about 53 cents of every one of your income tax dollars, and about 47 cents goes to everything else in the budget. But if we look at this historically, one of the things that we have to recognize is that the very notion of what is rural in the first place is the creation of the military. What do I mean by that? Well, European settlers looking westward from the East Coast looked out at what they identified as an empty wilderness. And that's the language. That's the language starting in the 17th century, a wilderness which needs to be tamed, conquered, all the rest of that vocabulary, in order for wilderness to become rural, rural with its associations of pastoral and idyllic and agricultural. So the process of turning wilderness into rural is a military process. What I mean by that, obviously, is that the military, the federal military, and then state military, state National Guards as well, clear the space of its original inhabitants. That's true east of the Mississippi in the 1830s and 40s, and of course, it's true west of the Mississippi after the Civil War is over. One historian's best estimate is that between 1790 and 1890, which really marks the end of the age of Indian warfare, the American military, again, either the federal government or state militias or combinations, the American military engaged in 1,600 battles of one size or another with indigenous people. 1,600 over a span of a century. Now, I'm not great at math, but divide that by 100, and that's 160 military encounters a year, which is about 3 a week on average across the span of the 19th century. So before we can even have a rural, before those yeoman farmers even have land to cultivate, we had to clear that space, and we did that through the military. The second thing I would observe about the military, and it's the acronym there you see on the slide. I wonder how many of you know this acronym, USACE. It stands for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The Corps is older than the nation itself. They are very proud of this. They date themselves to 1774. The Corps of Engineers is why West Point was founded early in the 19th century, not to train officers, but to train engineers for the Army Corps of Engineers. And it exists today as one of the great octopuses in American life. Its tentacles are everywhere, and it is unbelievably hard to pin down with any transparency. At one point, when I was working on this project, I thought I could write a whole book about the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and no one has. And I think no one has in large part because trying to get at the archival sources is very, very difficult. It's very slippery. It exists in a bureaucratic no man's land, and it's not particularly transparent or accountable or anything else. So I gave up that particular idea, but I did a chapter in this book on the Army Corps of Engineers. What I mean to say that it has a profound impact on the rural is the following. Very crudely put, the Corps manages water. And in the 19th century, that meant things like canal building in the state of Ohio and elsewhere. The Corps is central to that. It meant dredging, straightening waterways, all to promote commerce through navigation, when that was the major form of navigation. In the 20th century, the Corps has been responsible for damming up the water. And so when you drive around, let's say the state of Ohio, and you know, there are no natural lakes anywhere in the state of Ohio. So anytime you see a lake, it's the result of a dam. And chances are it's the result of a dam built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. But my own sense of things is that there isn't a single watershed anywhere in the continental United States that hasn't been reshaped by a Corps of Engineers project. So again, you drive through these spaces and there's the lake, and maybe we're going to go boating or fishing over there. There's the river that is flowing the way it is flowing, and you don't really have any sense that this is a deliberately engineered space, that the water is being managed here, and it's being managed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The final thing I'll say about the military shaping of rural America, as you can see from the third line of the slide, the military maintains a footprint across the United States and largely in rural places. The image you're seeing on the left there, and it's shot through a fisheye lens just so that you can get a slightly bigger vision of it, is the White Sands, New Mexico missile testing range. That site is approximately 3.5 million acres big. It is therefore 50% larger than the nation's largest national park, which is the continental United States, which is Yellowstone at about 2 million acres. Taken all together, the bases, the installations, the testing sites and ranges and so on and so forth occupy an area roughly the size of the state of Kentucky. This is, as I said, a huge footprint on the United States, and mostly in rural areas. The bases, in turn, become, when they're located, the economic lifeline for those communities. And that's another thing that I examined in this book. They bring in lots of people, they bring in lots of money. The whole economy begins now to revolve around this base. And you can see that most dramatically in areas of the country, and I studied one of these, where military bases have been closed. So I examined a place called Sawyer Air Force Base on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which was started in the 1950s and then closed in the mid 1990s after the Cold War was over. When the plug got pulled on the Sawyer base, the entire area, and this is in Marquette County up in the UP, the entire region just imploded. The schools closed, the power plants actually, one of the power plants closed down. There was no more demand for electricity. So these places have become, as I would suggest, addicted economically to the military. So in all of these ways, rural America is absolutely connected to and shaped by the American military, and it has been from the very beginning of the nation. So that's the first big force that I was looking at. The second big force is industrialization. We tend to posit these as, if I say rural industrialism, you think that sounds a little jarring. It may be a little bit like an oxymoron. We tend to think of industry, urban, and agriculture, rural. Pastoral versus infernal, right? And that's simply, as I dug into this, simply not true. In fact, agriculture industrialized in this country at exactly the same time and exactly the same pace as industrialization happened everywhere in the United States. I'll give you a little factoid about this, which I like to use with my students. In 1860, it took 61 hours of labor to produce 1 acre of wheat. 61 hours. By 1890, 30 years later, it took 3 hours of labor to produce an acre of wheat. Now, what changed? Well, what changed is what you're seeing in the slide. Industrial technologies, in this case, it's the McCormick Reaper factory in Chicago, being sent out into these agricultural areas, labor-saving machinery. Farmers are at the forefront to industrialize the production, first of row crops, and eventually, of course, of animals. All right, we don't call them factory farms for nothing. You can see here in the slide as well, I've pulled an advertising slogan from the International Harvester Corporation. International Harvester was created by the merger of McCormick and a couple of other of these farm implement manufacturers into a big conglomerate. International Harvester, of course, still around today. And in the 1920s, they did an ad campaign under that label, every farm a factory. That was the goal. Turn your farm into a factory. And what has this meant? Well, what this has meant in all kinds of obvious ways is that just as with other kinds of industrial production, the scale gets bigger, it becomes cheaper, and you need fewer and fewer people to do it. So the average size of a farm in the 19th century in Ohio is about 150, maybe 140 acres. I was talking to a farmer a couple of years ago who said to me, look, if you want to actually make it as a farmer economically in the state of Ohio, you need at least 2,000 acres. The average size of farms across the midsection of the country has gone up and up and up as a consequence of the industrialization of agriculture. But the flip side of this is that since the 1930s, there has been a consistent and concerted push to try to move industrial manufacturing out into the countryside. Let me take 2 steps back. I just said that industrializing agriculture has meant less need for labor. That meant that more and more people were leaving farm areas and moving to, well, say Chicago or Detroit or Philadelphia or Cleveland, looking for jobs. The solution, many people believed, was to move those factories out of Cleveland and into rural areas so people wouldn't have to leave. They could have a job in a factory right there. This becomes federal policy starting in the 1930s and is still the case today. It also becomes policy in many states as well. Another way to put this is welcome to Marysville, Ohio. Honda built its first American plant in the middle of the state, in the middle of the cornfields. And if you're driving a Honda right now, the chances are it was assembled at that Marysville plant. When you look at the American auto industry, and it's a really good example of the phenomenon I'm describing, we don't really make cars in Detroit anymore, or in Flint, Michigan, or in Cleveland. We make them out in rural areas with good highway access and cheaper labor and lower taxes and state giveaways, I should say. That's a big part of the equation as well. So this moving big factories like the Honda plant out into the countryside really takes off after the Second World War. And this is another way in which rural becomes industrialized. Honda, if you know Honda at all, Marysville is the big assembly plant, but it is the center. Let's think of it as the sun, and there's a solar system of suppliers and parts manufacturers, also all located in rural areas. One of the places I went to visit is just off I-75, north of Dayton, a place called Anna, Ohio, which is where Honda has its engine plant. So the engines are built in Anna and then shipped by truck over to Marysville to be put in the cars. Anna, Ohio is a town with fewer than 1,500 residents, which means that every day more people come to work in that engine plant than actually live in the town. And as I said, just a nice example of the way the countryside has been industrialized. We also tend to think of this disconnect, right? This is the way we talk about it popularly. There's Wall Street and there's Main Street. And Main Street is a small town, and it's the mom and pop shops, and it's the little diner and everything else. And that's also not true. I wanted to look at the way in which big national corporations had an impact on rural areas. But what I really discovered is that rural areas have an enormous impact on big national corporations. I'm showing you, this is a cardinal mistake. This is a rookie mistake for any book talk, that you mention somebody else's book. But this is my colleague and friend Bart Elmore and his book called Country Capitalism, which also came out last year. And it's if you're interested in this topic, I would also direct you to Bart's book, because it's really terrific. And what it points out is that so much of our modern life, especially supply chain, logistics, delivery, was first invented, experimented with, refined by corporations like Federal Express, Amazon, all working in rural areas. And so, right, the world we inhabit now of online shopping and overnight delivery was invented in rural areas, which again, not something I think we think about when we think of rural places. I looked specifically at retail, and I looked at F.W. Woolworths. Many of you may remember Woolworths back when they were a fixture of small town Main Street. You went there to go shopping, and there was always a lunch counter there. You could have ice cream with your grandmother, like I did once or twice. And Woolworths, what I learned, of course, is that Woolworths started in the 19th century, late 19th century, in these farm towns. The busiest day of the week at any Woolworths was always Saturday, because farm families would come in and do their shopping then. Woolworths became this behemoth empire of retail stores by capitalizing on rural markets. That's what they did. Now, Woolworths has fallen onto some hard times. I'm happy to talk about that if anybody's interested. But it really was a rurally located retail success. The other image you see on the slide here is another thing I examined. The sort of the updated version of the Woolworths, and that's Dollar General. We all know about Walmart. I think most of us know about Walmart, another rurally based retail giant, right? At one point, I think Walmart was the largest single employer in the United States. I didn't write about Walmart because other historians have looked at that. There are roughly 3,500 Walmart stores around the country. There are, by anybody's best estimate, 18,000 Dollar Generals. Dollar General starts in a small town in Kentucky. It proliferates through the South and this is in the 1930s. By the 1980s, it's moving into the Midwest. And virtually all, until very recently, virtually all of these stores are located in small rural places. They are also, if you were to stick 18,000 pins in the map of where each Dollar General is located, you would have a map of American poverty. Dollar General, and they're quite proud of this. This is what I discovered in my research. Dollar General caters to customers who are too poor for Walmart. And think about that for a moment. Their CEO recently said, and this is not in the book because it happened after the book was in production, but he has recently said basically when times are good in America, we do well, but when times are bad, we do even better. Dollar General cheers for American poverty, rural poverty, because that's where it is making its money. And the fourth big force, and this is particularly true since the end of the Second World War, is the suburbanization of the American landscape. We think of suburbs as somehow growing out of central cities, and that is the model from the 1950s through the 1980s. But in the 1980s, we really begin to see a shift, and now farmland gets bought up by real estate developers, and it doesn't matter that if it's in a proximity to an urban center or not. You put in developments like this. This image, as it happens, I took on a trip I had last month to Nebraska. And this is when I was giving a talk in Lincoln. And I have said to people that the single biggest threat to rural land, to especially agricultural land, is suburban style real estate developers. And that's what you're seeing across the country, but especially in the midsection of the United States. And what about the role of the federal government? Remember, that's part of that ideology that I started with. What I would argue here is that every one of those forces I just described is built on a foundation laid by the federal government. Let's go to the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt, you see him there shaking hands with some farmers, was referred to as a country squire. Roosevelt was one of those Americans like Jefferson who didn't really have much use for American cities. And when we look at all of the New Deal and everything it was involved with, one of the things you start to notice is that it disproportionately was targeted at rural America. There was some stuff that for the unemployed of American cities, but mostly Roosevelt wanted to revive what he saw as rural areas in a kind of crisis. I'll point to two specific projects, though I could look at many. The Rural Electrification Administration, which begins its work in 1936, and it's important to remember that that nobody out there in rural America had electricity by the 1930s. The private sector power companies simply wouldn't string the lines out there. It was not cost effective for them. It was not profitable. And so into the 1930s, rural people were still living by candles or oil lamps or whatever it had. It was the 19th century. What the Rural Electrification Administration did was to provide federal money to help establish electric co-ops. And they're still out there. They're operating in almost every one of the states left over from the 1930s, these electrical co-ops. But the real kicker here is that by 1960, almost all rural homes now have electricity. And when you talk to people, or you dig into the research as I did, this is in some ways, for these folks, the miracle of the New Deal. They referred to it all the time as the night the lights came on. Here comes the co-op, here come the lines, and there's that moment when you flip the switch and all of a sudden you have electric power, and the night is now not totally dark. The second project I'll talk about here is the TVA, also still with us today. And this sort of puts together a lot of the issues I've been talking about. First and foremost, it's a flood control project. And you can see the Tennessee River Valley watershed, right? It goes all the way up into Western Virginia, up into Tennessee, North Carolina, and down into northern Georgia and Alabama. It's a huge area, prone to flooding, largely because it had been clear cut of timber, thanks coal miners and coal companies. But the second purpose of the TVA was to put hydroelectric generators in those dam projects. Now, cheap electricity is going to be available across this otherwise economically impoverished region. So the promise here is to a manufacturing company, build a new plant somewhere here in the Tennessee Valley, and you can have cheap, totally reliable electricity being generated from the TVA. And that is still the case. So the economic development here, connected to the control of the water, right, in order to move manufacturing and people out into the countryside, the TVA, I think, is exemplary of all of those projects, all of those goals. In 1940, Yale professor Whitney Griswold wrote in an essay that I dug up, sort of summarized what it is I'm trying to argue here. Those yeoman farmers asked for a whole lot of money, a whole lot of aid. The Jeffersonian ideal has been translated into policy. And I think that's largely accurate. I think that does describe the 1930s. And here you see these are farmers at an agricultural administration office here signing up for programs. I think that's still the case. I think our policies still work to translate this Jeffersonian ideal into policy. Somewhat more succinctly, and sitting in not Oxford, Mississippi, Oxford, Ohio, but Oxford, Mississippi, there is William Faulkner, who was no fan of the federal government, but was simply calling it like he saw it. Our economy is no longer agricultural. Our economy is the federal government. And what he's referring to are all the agricultural policies, the military expenditures that are now going on in Mississippi, and so on and so on and so forth. And you can see that's 1956. And yet, despite everything I've just said, the rural myth clings to us. I'm showing you the cover of the first issue of the Little House on the Prairie book. And I'm going to pick on Little House as maybe the best, most widely recognized example of how Americans in the 20th century doubled down on those Jeffersonian myths rather than acknowledge what was really going on in rural America at the time. Rural America, Little House is written very deliberately as a protest against Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Laura Ingalls Wilder, and we know this from letters, we know this from other kinds of sources. She was furious at the New Deal. She thought it was going to ruin America. And what she did was to turn her own childhood in the 19th century as an example for Americans. This is how Americans ought to live. Those books came out, I think the first one appeared in 1934. The last one appeared right at the start of the Second World War. So they really are, the whole series is a product of the 1930s. But then, of course, it was turned into a TV show that ran through the 1970s. What we get in Little House, as you see on the slide, is a nostalgia for a past that was never really true. The family itself, if you remember the stories, first homesteads in Minnesota, and they homestead right next to Mankato, Minnesota, where the federal government had just cleared the Sioux people out. The Sioux War, which took place in the middle of the Civil War, is still the episode with the largest mass execution in American history. Several dozen Sioux fighters were simply hung all together on the same day. So the federal government clears that space out, the Sioux are gone, and the Wilder family, or the Ingalls family, moves in. Pa's a terrible farmer, and so he moves the family repeatedly. He moves them all across the midsection of the country. At one point, they actually homestead on Indian reservation land, and then are told they can't actually live there, and this makes Pa really angry. He ought to have access to, and that's in Kansas, to this Osage reservation land. Not stable communities, not kind of prosperous farmers, right? None of that is actually true. And as one scholar has put it, what these novels really do is depict the family's struggle as the consequence of a nasty federal government. That's the ideology now that I think still permeates much of our understanding of rural America and certainly much of our political discourse. So in the end, what I concluded was that rural America has not been left behind. That's the title of a book that came out in 2017, and they certainly haven't been overlooked. That's the title of a book that came out last year. My understanding of rural America is that it really has been at the front of the national parade when we look at its connection to these big forces that have shaped our modern society. So I'll end with this, and then we can get to some questions if folks want. I'll end by saying, why is it then that we continue to talk about rural America using the language of crisis, decline, desperate, right? All you have to do is pick up any newspaper any week and you will find a story. Certainly that's been true over the last 8 years. You'll find a story about rural America in crisis. Well, I'm suggesting that that's not the right way to think about it. So how do I explain this perpetual set of this perpetual perception of crisis? Let me offer this, and I'm just playing with this idea here. I'm not sure whether it's right or not, but I'm thinking out loud. I think what the crisis measures is a disconnect between the myth and the reality of rural life. There's the myth on display again. That's a Currier and Ives print you see in the slide. Currier and Ives is an enormous printing company in New York City in the mid-19th century. You know Currier and Ives. And what they did was to print up lots of these kinds of idyllic images. There are the sheep there, right? Sheep safely grazing there on the American homestead, and sell them to middle-class people in New York City and Philadelphia and Boston, so they could hang them up in their dining rooms and say, "Oh, gee, isn't that nice? That's what America, that's what it should look like." But it doesn't. Life in rural America is varied, and it is difficult for some people, and very challenging, and it does not measure up to this myth that we have created. And I think it is that distance between rural life as it is and rural life as we all wish it were that accounts for the anger and the grievance that you hear, at least in some corners of rural America. I won't say all, but at least in some corners of rural America. So I'll end with that, and thank you all very much for hearing me through. And as I said, if we've got some questions, I'd be happy to try to take a swing at them.
Yeah, we have had a couple that have come in. So the first one is, what is the significance of the electoral college to non-urban regions? Oh my goodness, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's a great question. So look, the one of the ways in which rural America has been privileged is through the Electoral College. We know now, I mean, the political scientists have crunched all the numbers. It's really unarguable that rural people are overrepresented in our political system. That's both in Washington, but also in virtually every state in the country as well. And this is through things like gerrymandering here in Ohio. Ohio is one of the most gerrymandered states in the country, according to political scientists, and that gerrymandering gives rural voters more weight than urban voters. But of course, the system of electing our president, and I would remind people, I remind my students, there is no other democratic country on the planet that has anything like the Electoral College, because what it does is to privilege real estate over people. The and we can see this also play out in the U.S. Senate, right? The state of California has about 38 million people living in it, gets 2 U.S. senators. The state of Wyoming has about 600,000 people in it, gets 2 U.S. senators. I joke to people, when I used to teach at Ohio State, I taught classes bigger than Wyoming. But the idea here, right? Your vote counts for more in Wyoming than it does in California. It simply does, and there's no way around that. So that's also, I think, one of the things we have to reckon with. If rural Americans, some of them, feel angry at the political system, we have to at least acknowledge the other side of that coin, which is that you already have more access to the political system than people who live in many urban areas, and that's just structural, right? That's just baked in to the constitutional system.
Thank you, Steve. Um, so the next question is a two-parter, and it says, the first part is, what is the biggest misconception about rural America, particularly in the Midwest, Appalachia, Southeast, and East? And the second part of that question is, how do rural people differ between regions in the United States?
Yeah. So those are really two huge questions. Let me start with the second one and say that one of the problems I think we have in this whole discussion, whether we're talking politics or policy, is that we use the singular, rural, when in fact we ought to be using the plural. Rural America is vast and varied. And I talk about this a little bit in my book, though I don't drill down on it very much. But rural America includes, row crop country in the Midwest. It includes played out coal country in eastern Pennsylvania and through West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. It includes vast stretches of the Hispanic Southwest. It includes Native America. Most Indian reservations today are located in very rural, indeed remote places. The poorest 10 counties, according to the US Census in the country, are rural counties, and the wealthiest per capita county in the country, according to the census, is a rural county. So, right, how do we that's not that is a diversity, a range of experience that can't really be summarized using the singular. So that's one answer. I hope that answers the second part of your question. In terms of misconceptions, yeah, I think there are a number, right? I think that one of the misconceptions that I would point to is to come back again to this notion that people who live in rural areas somehow have access to a kind of uh, virtuous living, tight knit communities, and that somehow urban life is dangerous or alienated or all the kind of language that we continue to use about it. Um, that I think it's simply not true. It's not true in both directions. And I think we need to get out of talking about rural America in that way if we're really going to understand uh, what life is like for those folks.
So we've had several other questions come in. The next one is, how much federal funding has flowed into rural America?
Yeah. So again, like the answer I just gave to the question of political representation, federal dollars flow into rural areas disproportionately. Uh, and you, almost any way you slice and dice those numbers, you come up with the same conclusion. Some of this is in the form of federal programs. Some of this is in the form of subsidies, projects, special projects. Let me take two steps back to answer that question, to say that one of the things that I think we have to reckon with, as much as Americans may think that country living is something they ought to aspire to, country living is more expensive than urban living. And really, the way to put that is that living in areas of higher density is more efficient, less expensive than living in areas where people are all spread out. And so, if you expect the same kind of services that metropolitan people have in the 21st century, and I mean this, everything from like infrastructure, streets, water treatment, to schools, to medical care, to retail opportunity, all of that stuff is simply going to be more expensive the more you spread people out. It will become less expensive that the more closely together people are living. One of the things I discovered doing this research, and this is quite wonderful because somebody sent this to me, a former planning commissioner for a very rural county, in this case in Colorado, but he said that you can find these all over the web. There are little disclaimers in the county planning manuals, which are designed for people who are thinking about moving out to the country. And what it says is, remember that living out here, services are more expensive. And so your life is being subsidized by people who live, in this case, in Denver or Boulder, because we're shifting money from budgets there in order to support the more expensive lifestyle that you're living out here in the country. Never mind all of your self-sufficiency and your independence and all of that stuff. It's called the Code of the West, and as I said, you can find these in county documents all across the West, as people feel like, right, they want to go out and live that Yellowstone lifestyle, but in fact they're being enormously subsidized by people who are living in cities.
Thank you. The next question is, have you read Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver?
Yeah, I have not. It's on the list.
Ignore that question.
No, I appreciate that, because it's a reminder that, you know, this, I should move it to the top of the stack, because it's sort of fallen to the bottom of the stack as the stack grows higher. But thank you for that.
And that is fine. There was a question about that, but we will skip that for now. If we have you on again, we can ask you that then. So the next question then is, why during the recent election was rural America painted red?
Well, so I haven't looked closely at the electoral maps from last week. I'm still trying to process some of that. But let me take you back to 2016, where that's what historians like to do, by the way. We're much more comfortable when we get some distance on things. So you go back to the map of 2016, and here's what you will find. There are roughly 3,100 counties in the United States. Hillary Clinton won roughly 450 of those 3,100 counties. So, right, a tiny minority. Donald Trump won about 2,500 or 2,600 of those counties. Hillary Clinton, of course, as you will remember, won the popular vote by 3 million votes. So what does that mean? What can we conclude from that? Well, what we conclude from it is that Hillary Clinton won the counties where a majority of Americans actually live. And Donald Trump won in counties where the population is much, much smaller. But again, because of the way the electoral college system works and the way that's baked into our electoral process, the loser of the popular vote winds up winning the presidency. But as I was looking at this further, those 450 counties that Hillary Clinton won accounted for, by one economist's best estimate, almost 2/3 of the American GDP. So it's not just right. I mean, in some ways, maybe that's logical. It's where everybody lives, and where everybody lives is where the economy is strongest, or where the economy is biggest. And so, right, I think one of the things that that we have to reckon with is how do we negotiate that divide, right? That somehow rural areas with shrinking population in many areas, especially in the Midwest, lots of these rural counties continue to lose population, and where in a sense metropolitan people are making the money in the GDP and then sending it back to subsidize those people out there, and yet we still have these political divides. Um, you know, when you look at this data in real detail, what you'll discover is that every county may tell a slightly different story. It may become hard to generalize about all of this, but I think generalizations are important. And I think what you have at the moment is an electorate in rural counties, which, how do I want to say, for whom certain kinds of hot button cultural issues are more important than a lot of economic issues, and who feel somehow betrayed that the local schools just got consolidated, the regional hospital just closed because it can't afford to stay open, because they live in a food desert. Because that's one of the things I discovered as well. Some of the worst food deserts in the United States are right next to farm fields. Those farms don't actually grow food, right? Those industrialized farms. So on and on and on, right? They feel their lives are being undercut, though they're being undercut by the forces of American capitalism.
Perfect. And that concludes our questions
Right.
for the day, Steve. So thank you so much for being here with us today and really digging deep on this topic. And thank you to everyone who tuned in and asked questions. Just a reminder, our webinars are free for everyone, and you can check out all of our past and upcoming websites or webinars on our website, alumlc.org/MiamiOH. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day. Love and honor.